So first, as an introduction to this panel, before we get started, I wanted to thank the Kentucky Book Fair, or Kentucky Book Festival. I wanted to thank the Kentucky Humanities for the work that they've done in putting together this book festival and running it. And so especially thank Bill Goodman and Sarah Volpe for all of the work that they've done and the staff that works with them that has put this together. And I want to thank everyone running around in shelf care, self-care t-shirts. Not only are they great t-shirts, but this would not happen without all of the volunteer help. Thank you. And thank you also to Joseph-Beth for partnering, sponsoring, hosting, and then all of the other partners and sponsors. While we are not the only poets at this event, I think we might be the only panel exclusively of poets, and we're certainly the only panel with 2 poet laureates of Kentucky. The current poet laureate, Crystal Wilkinson, and a former poet laureate, Frank X. Walker. But I wanted to encourage you to go check out the poetry tables down below, but also know that the state of poetry in Kentucky is really helpful. It's strong, and while there might only be maybe 9 or 10 poets represented here because of pandemic times and the size of the festival, there have been many more books of poetry published this year. Poetry in Kentucky, as poetry everywhere, is a broad tent, and there are tastes for everyone. And we would encourage you to get bitten by poetry from the 2 poet laureates and then continue exploring on. But also I wanted to say something about small independent presses. Kentucky has a rich tradition of small independent presses. There's Larkspur, there's Saraband, there's Shadeland House Modern Press, there's Accents, there's Old Cove, there is Broadstone Books, there's Steel Toe Press, and the list goes on. And all published numerous books this year. And again, not all books are published this year are represented here. So go out and check, because all literature is local. All literature is written in a place and in conversation with a community of writers. And perhaps no writing group illustrates that better, in my mind, than the Appalachian poets. And this year, the Appalachian poets celebrate their 30th year of the beginning. Back in 91 at UK, when Frank and Nikki and Crystal and Kelly and Mitchell and Ricardo and Gerald Coleman and others got together and started writing, and here we are 30 years later, and it's not sitting on laurels. In the back, there's Bernard Clay, and Bernard Clay's English Lit came out a couple of years ago and has come out again. I encourage you to go downstairs and look at it and get it. So Bernard Clay's come out with a book. Makalani Bandelli has come out with his 2nd book this year. Joy Priest came out with her 1st book this year. A year ago, Keith Wilson came out, or maybe it could have been 2 years ago, Keith Wilson came out with his book. Danny Quintos is coming out with a book this coming year. Ricardo Nazario Colon has just signed contract for a book of his own, which is to say, the Appalachians are continuing to write, continuing to tell the story of Kentucky. and broaden that story and enrichen that story through poems and novels and short stories. So with that said, I guess we should move to what y'all are here for, which is some poetry and some conversation about poetry. Specifically, the book that Frank has with him is Black Box. The book that Crystal has with her is Perfect Black. And one of the things I think about Perfect Black is that this is a book that spans 30 years of writing. It spans the history of the Appalachians as Crystal has been writing poetry. I mean, most people know of Crystal as a short story writer and as a novelist, and yet along the way, consistently, she's been writing poems dating all the way back to 91 and beyond, as in earlier. There are deep connections, it seems to me, between Black Box and Perfect Black. There are poems that center on the question of religion and how religion plays a role both in informing one's sense of self and who one is, but also I think informing what one writes about and how one writes and the stories that one writes and the cadences with which one writes. There are, between these two books, stories about foodways, about the way grandmothers and mothers cook and the foods they prepare and what they bring and give of themselves to their families. There are stories that engage with the deep history of Kentucky. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Crystal and see what she has to bring to us.
Can you all hear me? Yes, you can. I think I'll just read a couple of poems and then pass the mic to Frank, and then we may have another round if we have time. I'll just read the first. This book is divided up into three parts. The first part is about girlhood, about Black rural girlhood, my Kentucky Black rural girlhood. It is basically a memoir in verse, which was kind of scary because I'd always buried my truths in fiction, which was one reason I think that I never had a collection of poetry before. The middle section are sort of burgeoning political awareness poems, and the third section is Ain't I a Woman kind of poems about motherhood and about being a woman in contemporary. So I'll just read a couple from the front. This is the first poem, which I think was highly influenced by James Steele's Heritage. So this is sort of my version of that. Terrain. The map of me can't be all hills and mountains, even though I've been country all my life. The twang in my voice has moved downhill to the flatland a time or two. My taste buds have exiled themselves from fried green tomatoes and rhubarb for goat milk and pine nuts. Still, I return to old ground time and again, a homing blackbird destined to return. I am plain brown bag, oak and twig, mud pies and gut-wrenching gospel in the throats of old tobacco brown men. When my spine crooks even further toward my mother, I will continue to crave the bulbous tang of wild shallots, the familiar game of oxtail and kraut boiling in a cast iron pot. I toe dive in all the rivers, sinking the whole of me, scout virtual African terrain, sifting through ancestral memories, but still, I'm called back home through hymns sung by stout Black women in large hats and flowered dresses. You have to risk the briar bush to reach the sweet dark fruit, and ain't no country woman all church and piney woods. There is pluck and cayenne pepper There is juke joint gyrations in the young and barren girth of this belly and these supple hips. All roads lead me back across the waters of blood and breast milk. From ocean to river, to the lake, to the creek, to the branch and stream, back to the sweet rain, to the cold water in the glass I drink when I thirst to know where I belong. And I'll just share one more. Maybe I'll read one of the Water Witch poems. My grandfather was a water witch. Do you all know what a water witch is? There's some of my people in the audience. Do you know what a dowser is? So my grandfather was a dowser. He used to go out into the woods and get the branch from a peach tree. And people would get him to come and dig their wells or their cisterns. And so he was known as a water witch. And my grandfather, I think, was one of the wisest men that I knew, even though he only had a third grade education. So there's a suite of water witch poems in the book, and I'll just read one of those. And it's the only poems in the book that are sort of outside my voice. So this is my grandfather's voice. So I'm not an actor, but I'm becoming Silas Wilkinson at this point. The Water Witch on Reading. Oh, I cipher pretty good, and can't no white man cheat me on my crops or on my change at the feed store. I'm known around these parts for being able to remove a wart with a bean. I'm the only one they come to when they want their well witched, and now everybody asks me how many snows we're going to have come winter, or when they need to pull a baby from a mama's tit. Man from way off stopped here once for me to teach him how to make sorghum. Been learning all my life. I can read a map, can read a man's eyes to see if he's truthful. I can level a girder by sight. I can read the tremble in a cow's gut, a man's footprints in the mud. I can read a man's heart to see if he's right with the Lord, though it ain't my place to say. I can read time by my own shadow. I can read the corners of Christine's mouth and tell if she's mad at me. Only thing I can't read is words. Thank you.
Let me read a couple of poems as well. The volume is good. Try to choose some poems that complement those two. Thank you, Crystal, again. This first poem reminds me of my mother. I can't help but think about her today. My very first professional reading was here in Joseph-Beth when Appalachian came out, and I think we were not in this space, but somewhere else. But there was a big banner of the cover of the book hanging from the ceiling, and she stared at it the whole time she was here. She just kept dreaming, this dreamy look in her eyes, looking at herself. She was on the cover of the book, 20 foot tall, but hanging from the ceiling. And I remember that smile. So being in this space at a reading makes me think about her. So this is called Creek Philosophy. Mama turned us out of doors to discover what it means to be human. My search led me off the asphalt, down the narrow, worn path to the creek, where I studied with the master, learning to recognize what I would come to know as resilience, while experiencing the humility of my failed attempts to stop the flow of water with dumb, round stones. Even my perceived ability to direct its steady current proved more a lesson in cooperation than control. Skipping rocks came to represent what the delicate surface of water had to say about deflecting hard times and even harder people, until they were slow and heavy enough to just let go of. I grew to understand that if I could hear the individual voices and the heavy percussion of water falling, then I would see my heart beat, feel the blood in my own creeks when I made a fist, and eventually come to know the difference between being heavy in the world and knowing peace. My mother was a pacifist, and she always knew what to say when any of us were angry, and there were a lot of us to have their anger tempered. And she was an expert at it. Let me read one other. I've talked to so many people about the Hyman workshop this summer. I want to read a poem that was written in celebration of being a Hyman and leaving a party that George Ella Lyon threw in her space. The noise in the background. I'm reading a poem called After Charlotte Left George Ella's Party at Hyman. And it's about leaving George Ella's party and crossing a metal bridge that's covered with spider webs. And was just amazing. If I had a camera, I'd have taken 100 pictures of it. It was so amazing. But not quite as amazing as George Ella's party. This is for the Appalachian Writers Workshop, which I had the pleasure of teaching it again this summer. And I believe this is about 10 summers ago of this poem. Must have been some gathering last night. Widows and the long-legged must have filled every corner in the room, nesting on floors and porches, hip bone to hip bone, thorax to thorax, crowding on the furniture, knees and laps hanging from the ceiling. Did you see all them spider quilts on the bridge this morning? Some bodies was up all night, must have stumbled down the hill, bobbing and weaving, still drunk off all that pure grain music. Looked at the splayed metal fingers holding up the wooden planks, straddling troublesome creek, and thought, damn, class already started. Sat down on the bank and wove this poem. Thank you.
I'm also going to try to connect with theirs, but the problem is this is going to be the grinding of gears because I'm reading from a collection of poems set in 16th century Mexico, largely, with the occasional foray into the 16th century, the Caribbean and Peru. But we'll do what we can. The title of this poem is Malintine Remembers Cortes. Malintine is also known as La Malinche or Doña Marina, and she was the translator for Cortes. And especially in the 20th century, was rather vilified by writers like Octavio Paz and a few others who cast her as a traitor. And so this is a poem called Malintine Remembers Cortes. There are a handful of Nahuatl words in the poem. Most of the words refer to family relations, husband, father, child. It's not the heart of Cihuatl that wanders. Cihuatl means woman. I've thought of this often since his passing, and even before, kept in Coyoacan, jackals, coyotes, rogues, the lot of them. It's not that the body might not, as his has, desire others, but what is desire? Who am I, sold by my Tlacpatli stepfather, sold by my Tlacpatli as slave, after Nanitzin bore him as Tepitzin to care about empires? No, I never wavered. It was a matter of the body, not heart. Nothing to do with the little pleasures these men have taken, given, but a question of the stomach, of children and hunger. Let mouths curse me, call me traitor. What do I care about the world of men? And my second poem for the moment is titled Kipu. A kipu is an Andean mnemonic device, right? Unlike the Mayans that had an ideogrammic writing, right? So they used pictographs to write. The Quechua in the Andes did not write, but they did have a way to keep memory and to keep inventory and to communicate through material means, and that was the kipu. The kipu is a woven necklace that's also knotted, and so your knots have symbols. The color of the strands we think might have symbols, but it's a memory device based on a denary number system. So this is called a kipu. A small necklace of hand-turned cotton and llama wool, black, beige, burnt sienna, and gray, like the culua of Wari or Cusco, threads spun into supple memory. From the central sinuous cord radiate finer plates, inti rays that emanate from behind a partial eclipse. Each strand sung and sung again into knots. Not a poetry of cold, hard things, but story braided and tied into knots. A census taken before, and then also after war. An inventory of the papa yield at the birth and death of Manco Capac's son. The ages and names of the virgins taken and left in the snows. The laments chanted after floods, after droughts. The dates when the quila turns blood red. Kipu, cotton spun history. Woolly knowledge knotted. Plaited prayers of the Kipu Kamayok. Kipu, unheard prophecy unsung. Crystal, I was wondering, thinking about this question of family, and family runs through the book. It's a memoir. Family runs through so much also then of Frank's own poems, whether they're Appalachia, whether it's Black Box, whether it's The Last Will, Last Testament. There's that family. There's also the family of writers, and in a poem like On Being Country, you speak of moving sort of back and forth between Indian Creek and here, and finding in Appalachia home, finding in Appalachia in that community of writers family. What role has family played in your own writing, your sense of self, and in being able to carry on that 40-year career that you've had so far?
Well, I mean, I think family is the spine of it, right? Family is the spine of what I write. And so, and that's textured and layered. So, of course, my immediate family, I write a lot about my grandparents who are basically the core of my existence. I write about the absence of my mother and father, which is also the core of my existence. I write a lot about family that are on the ancestral plane that I've never met, but I'm sure have made me who I am. And I think along with that, sort of the found family of Appalachia, I don't think I would have survived without them. I think being in the presence of the other Appalachian poets was the first time that I felt like I could embrace all of myself. You know, my country self and my Black traveled sort of across Kentucky and elsewhere looking for a literary family, as with my shy beginning writer self, who was sort of just sitting in corners and kind of watching. And so I would go to various conferences and be the only Black one there. I would go to other conferences where there were a lot of Black people, but few or none of them had a sensibility of family, a sensibility of region and sort of the culture that I came from. So when I met Frank, we had never met, but we were actually grew up 30 minutes from each other. Our first cousins are married to each other, but we didn't meet until right after the beginning of the Appalachian Poets. And so there was an instant connection, you know, not just with Frank, but with the entire group that became sort of my first full-fledged family outside of blood. And so it means a lot. It means more than just the word. Like, we've all been through the births of each other's children. We've shared many, many meals. We've been through the deaths of important loved ones with one another. You know, the first book deal for pennies on up to to other kinds of success. So it's been sort of the spine of my literary career so far.
And sort of related to that question, because certainly land runs through Perfect Black, but land runs through your work as well, Frank. How does that land and the understanding of land run through your imagination as a writer?
Well, that's a great question. I know that, you know, not to discount family, because I was getting ready to talk about family.
You can talk about family,
but you know, this is I like claiming Kentucky. I like claiming Central Kentucky. I like claiming Danville. But I think it feels even more special when the same space claims you back. I mean, to be named Poet Laureate is not something that you do for yourself. It is something that that place does for you. So it was a tremendous honor for me to be in Frankfort and to find out that my hometown brought 2 school buses full of people, including students and parents and people who took off work to be there to share that moment. That was a moment not just for me, but for us. It feels good to drive home since 2013 and to see a sign that claims me and welcomes me back home. Every time I see it, no matter which direction I come in, I can't sneak into town without seeing one of those signs, and it feels good. And so that space for me has always been reciprocal. I love writing about that same space. So family and identity and place and social justice and history, they all overlap, but at the root of all of that is still that land, that space, and that family. And what I've learned over the years is how big that's gotten. It's no longer limited to Kentucky. It's wherever I've made friends. You know, my college roommate turned out to be from Puerto Rico by way of Brooklyn, the Bronx, New York. He would shoot me for that. It meant I had another home. And when I sat down at the table and ate a meal that his mother prepared and tried to not count how much Spanish I was missing, but knew that there was love there, and just in the way that she treated me and referred to me as her other son, I knew that I no longer lived in Kentucky. Singularly, I lived in the Bronx as well. And every time that happened, you know, I now have a home in the Caribbean. My mother's, you know, is mentally from everywhere, it seems. I remember being in Cuba and then again in Jamaica and then in Africa and seeing people who looked like my mother after she had passed on. And every time I would see those faces, it was like a kiss. The idea of land is almost ephemeral now because it's no longer limited to a specific geographical space. It's more of an idea and a place where I feel a kind of warmth and love that's reciprocal. And I think that's starting to show up in my work as well. My writing is more expansive, but it's still grounded in the same place, in that same home that has family at the center.
And with that, I mean, so your comments, especially about seeing the face of your mother, whether it's in Jamaica, whether it's in Africa, brought to my mind a section at the end of Perfect Black, praise song for the kitchen ghosts, where, Crystal, you talk about waking up and hearing the voice of Ma Aggie coming to you and speaking to you, and right, that's a reference to that astral plane. It's a reference to the spiritual plane, to the voices that of our ancestors that speak to us. That's a connection both to land and to family. But how does that play a role in y'all's writing? That listening to, whether it's the voice of the past, whether it's the voice of the ancestors, and how do y'all listen to this and then give voice and honor to the ancestors?
Yeah, for me, it plays into, and I've done some literal research of my family and my family lines and found out a lot of information. But of course, being a direct descendant of enslaved people, there are not a lot of records. So like in the case of my ancestor Aggie, who was born in 1795 in Virginia as an enslaved child, and then brought to Kentucky in 1808, there's a period of time where there are no records of her. So that's where she enters my imagination. And I say enters my imagination, but I think she also enters my spirit. And that actually happened when I was in Florida on a writing retreat, and I had sat with what I knew about Aggie and the idea of her with the hopes of writing a memoir or writing some nonfiction about her, and then to be so disappointed because there were no records, and to sort of muse on that, and then to wake up literally with her voice saying, I hear my mother calling my name, but not in your language. And it still brings tears to my eyes because that was so plain, because I had sort of lived with what I knew about her and the idea of her all night for several nights. And then I feel like she literally came to me on the beach in Florida with that. And from there, I took off in writing, I don't know, a hybrid piece. And that's not really the first time that it happened that profoundly, but I think that I'm always sitting in the present and looking back. Always. Like I'm not just Crystal Wilkinson sitting here. I am the daughter of Dorsey, who's the daughter of Christine, who was the daughter of Anna, who was and so forth and so on. So it's always present with me, and it always sort of comes through the writing. This whole idea of looking forward, looking at the present, and looking back.
If I respond to the same question, I would say for me, it shows up more in my historical poetry. I have books about Isaac Murphy, Medgar Evers, and a third book about York, as in Lewis and Clark and York, that comes out next year. It seems that not only do those poems never let go since I began looking with intentionality at them and at that direction and space, there are connections that happen not just for me, but for my mother. Somebody reminded me earlier today that when I was writing the York poems for the first time, my mother would call me in the morning right at 8 o'clock. And she knew I was working on that particular book. And she would ask me if York said anything new that morning. She knew I wrote it in the morning. And she would call right at 8. And what she wanted me to do was to read that new poem. And she'd always say, read it again. And then usually a third time, read it again. And then she would just hang up. Then check on me, ask about my day. She just wanted to hear from York, not me, from York. And she came to the unveiling of the York statue on the Belvedere in Louisville. And there was a moment about to pull the string and unveil him officially. It was a storm was coming in, and the wind by itself just picked up the cloth and unveiled it. And she just swooned. And I was so jealous that she had that connection. But it wasn't just me, it was a whole familial thing. We claim Yorks with such a strength that I have a whole series of buffalo tattoos across my body that began because of that connection that we had as a family to York and that story.
That's amazing. I think we're going to get some questions for the audience. If you guys don't mind, can stick around for a few questions. Anybody have a question they'd like to anybody? Oh, come on now, you guys. I know. Okay, well, we can also throw out a few questions. Crystal, I know you've probably talked about what's coming in the future, but can you talk to us about your writing day? How does your day-to-day go?
On the good days, I'm an early morning writer. So when I feel like I am writer with a capital W, I'm up at 3 or 4, and sort of writing toward the sun. And I started this habit years ago because my mother would call at 7 every day. And so I'd get up at 3 and I'd go, okay, ooh, I gotta hurry up because she's gonna call and she's gonna want to talk a long time. And of course now she passed away in 2016, but it's still, I think I am most awake and most creative and most tapped into my imagination at 3 a.m. Although the older I get, the more likely it is that I'm still up at 3 a.m. instead of going to sleep and then waking up at 3 a.m. But it's still prime time for me.
Frank, what about you?
It depends on the day. I have a 3-year-old at home, so whatever time remaining after his demands have been met, we split up and figure out when the writing happens. And my wife is also a writer and editor, so a lot of non-writing writing happens in the house, which is rereading and editing. And because we both teach, it's a lot of reading other people's work year-round. Even in the summer, we do a lot of summer workshops, which is harder and harder to find time to do our own work. But when she's going to sleep, I'm waking up.
Sometimes we cross.
Sometimes we cross over. Crystal is the only person I know that I can send a message to at 2:30 or 4:30 in the morning and expect to answer. And she always responds. I'm like, I knew you were up, And we may go back and forth, and then we'll say, okay, back to work, because it's starting to sound like work. Our day jobs at UK. But I think writers look for the quietest space in their day to do that kind of work in. And I grew up in a large family, so my quiet time was always before everybody woke up. So 4:30, not 3 a.m. for me. Then I work as hard as I can before the day starts, and then other works take over. And that's been the last 35 plus years for me.
Jeremy, what about you?
About the same. Though it is flip-flop between staying up late at night and writing after everybody goes to bed to probably the last 10 years, it's been waking up early. Sometimes it's been waking up as early as not 3, but as early as 4. And then it's just stealing time during the day, taking an extra 30 minutes at lunch.
Wow, great. Anybody have another question? Otherwise, I'm going to...
There's one behind you.
Yay! Thank you very much. What is your earliest memory of writing a poem?
Well, this is sort of close to home because my earliest memory of writing a poem is actually written down, but I can't find it. So I've spent the last 3 weeks looking for my journals, and I've called my kids over to go up in the attic, and it's been a long story, but I can't find it. But it's a bad rhyming poem. Yeah, it's there. I think I was 10 or 11. I've always kept a journal, and I have journals going all the way back till I was 10 or 11. And that's one of the first poems that I remember that's in there. Horrible. Nothing about Kentucky. It's about Chicago, somewhere that I had never been.
Mine is easy. 7th grade, February 13th. In an empty car to Delphine Bartleston. I come to the library on the 14th and hand her my card and a giant candy bar. And she takes the candy bar and turns and gives it to her boyfriend. And I hated poetry ever since.
It was, I was 15. We were supposed to do something with vocabulary words, and I just started playing with them, and it turned out to be a poem. And then that was in English. And then about a year and a half later, I started playing with words in Spanish. We were living, along with the southern U.S., when I was 7, we moved to Nicaragua. And so I actually grew up between Central America and the Caribbean. And so I grew up with Spanish, and shortly after English, I was writing in Spanish.
Gotcha. You have another question? Great, thank you. Does anybody else have another question? If that's, now I'm going to selfishly, because you called out the folks in the gray t-shirts, can't thank you all enough for being here on the 40th anniversary of the Kentucky Book Festival. Could you quickly tell us what it means to each of you to be here on this day with all of these folks? You'll just give us a sense of, from your perspective, because we walk up to your tables and we're in awe and we love your books. But what does it mean to an author to come to an event like this?
What it reminds me of is not so much, it's an honor as an author for people to come up to my table and want their book signed or to talk about any individual book that they've read. But what it always reminds me of is that my first Kentucky Book Fair in Frankfort, which has been, I don't know how many years ago, but I was such a Jane Steele fan, and I had never met him. And I remember Frank doing this to me, like, go on up there to meet him. And I was just standing there, starstruck. And I don't think I ever got in the line, but I remember that being seeing an author for the first time whose book I had not just read, but loved. And Frank trying to encourage his friend to go see her hero, but I didn't.
And for me, it's a reunion because people forget that we love books and authors too. And some of my best friends, some of the people who have encouraged and supported me the most, I get to see at the same time. And the hardest thing is to sit there and want to go across the room and get in that line and do that same thing with them, but also understand that I can do that afterwards, and I don't want to steal other people's time because it's such a long line, and we do this all day. In the early morning when we first get here, it's always a chance to do that. But today, for some reason, you guys were here at 10 and ready to go. We didn't get to have our fellowship like we usually get, but we don't mind that. We think that's a great thing. But I love that part of it for me. It's always that chance, and I look forward to that part of it, just to see those faces again. And I remember my James Steele moment, trying to figure out, why are these people out in the hallway? The book fair is inside, but it was the line to get to him. And then my first book fair as an author, they put me right next to Wendell Berry. And I could see this huge line just forever. And I remember people would stand in line forever, but treat me like I was on the sign with on the corner with a homeless sign, and not looking me in the eye. And at some point, Wendell noticed what was happening, and he would take his book and tell people, "Oh, you should see this young man right next to me," and force them to look at me. And then they would just get out of line, embarrassed to not obey Wendell Berry. And then people were getting in line behind them because there was a line. And I actually sold a few books that day.
Yeah, I agree with, except I wasn't there for the James Still. So, but it is, along with being in a community of writers, writers are readers. And so being in a space like this and being at the book festival is a homecoming because we're in a sea of readers. And it's reading that makes us writers. It's reading that feeds us and gives us the language to write with. And it feels comfortable to be with people who love words and language as much as we do. So thank you.
Please get a round of applause for them. That was great. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been a real treat.